Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar, how to combine Sitecore and Google Analytics to create a 360 customer view. There's a few ground rules for today. We're going to have plenty of time for Q&A at the end of today's session. If you do have questions, please put these onto your input them into the toolbar on the right-hand side of the screen. My name is Mario Kiriakou and I'll be moderating today. Not going to talk too much about us because we always really hate talking about us, but it's going to be really brief who Ratio is. So Ratio is a Sitecore digital agency and a optimization specialist. So we work predominantly with about 20 Sitecore clients, and we work with them to get the best out of the Sitecore platform in terms of helping users leverage the marketing functionality, things like A/B testing, personalization. But also one of the things we're really quite passionate about is how to enhance and extend the platform by integrating it with your other bits of marketing technology, which all businesses use. Very rarely do you just use one tool to rule them all. So today's presenter is Douglas Morris. He is head of optimization here at Ratio, and today's topic is something which we get asked about on a regular basis, how to combine Sitecore and Google Analytics, hence today's webinar. So I'm going to pass over to my erstwhile colleague to talk us through the rest of today's session.
Thank you very much, Mario. Hi, everyone. So yeah, as Mario said, we actually get asked quite a bit how better to use Sitecore and Google Analytics in tandem when it comes to analytics. There's some features and benefits of each, and then there's also some ways that they can work together quite nicely in a complementary way. So I guess the first thing to go through is what are actually the strengths of each platform. In which use cases would you use Sitecore by itself? In which use cases would you use Google Analytics? What are the merits of integrating the two together? So firstly, looking at the relative strengths of Sitecore, the first thing is that, and some of this will be a little bit technical, but the first thing is that it's server-side. So where Google Analytics is a little bit of tracking code that's put on your page where people can stop working using an ad blocker, for argument's sake. Sitecore is run purely from the server side, and that means that the numbers are going to be a bit more accurate. So it might report a higher number of visits than Google Analytics, and that's simply because some of those visits or users in GA have actually blocked the GA tracking code from working. One really great feature of Sitecore from an analytics point of view, and also obviously testing and personalization, is this ability to bucket people into personas. So that's not something that you can do very easily at all using Google Analytics. And were you to create segments in Google Analytics to represent these personas, it doesn't have quite as neat a way of moving people between the personas. So I really do think that's a very strong rationale for using Sitecore in some way, shape, or form. Obviously, it's your content management system, so it's the source of truth on what each piece of content is that you're publishing. And if you're writing blogs, for argument's sake, all you'll be able to tell in GA out of the box is maybe the URL of the blog or the page title. Whereas obviously there's a lot of rich information that sits within the CMS about that, like the taxonomy, for argument's sake. And that is another reason that Sitecore, the data within Sitecore needs to be tapped into. Sitecore has a great focus on individuals as opposed to, I guess, groups of users. So you can't really see in this little picture, but there are great features that you can, for example, give access to your sales team so that they can explore the journey of individual people or organizations. Whereas Google Analytics is better at analyzing the behavior of much larger groups of people. The engagement value, which I'm sure you've all heard of, is quite a nuanced way of evaluating for all the people that don't convert, which can be 99%, 95% or whatever, how engaged were they in their journey? Now that's business dependent. It's not the right metric for every business, like a transactional business, for argument's sake, but for the right business, it is actually quite a good one. And obviously, well, hopefully it's your testing tool. So it's also the source of truth ultimately for which one of your users saw which experience. Conversely, if you look at the strengths of Google Analytics, well, it's probably already where you're going to make all the rest of your marketing decisions. You've probably got information there around what marketing campaigns you're executing on, and other information of that sort. And so that definitely is an advantage to using GA if you already have it embedded in the organization and those are the numbers that you're using as your source of truth. Expanding on that point, you're probably going to have organizational competencies around GA. So it would be, I think, definitely the analytics tool with the largest market share, and that means it's easier to find people that are familiar with it and to train them if they're not. It really is, although it's just one point on its own here, the ability to create segments or groups of users in Google Analytics and then look at the behavior of those users really is one of its absolute unique selling points. Well, not unique, there's other tools out there that can do it, but it can't be overstated how powerful that is. And obviously it's got integrations with the rest of the Google marketing ecosystem. So where you're running ads, or you have on the display network or on AdWords, you're probably already pulling in information about those ads, like how much they cost, what keyword people were searching, and all that sort of stuff. So to have that data in GA is quite a strength as well. What we normally suggest then, given that GA is the source of truth for your marketing data, is to let that continue to be the source of truth, and still make use of some of the Sitecore key benefits. So obviously it's a CMS, so it's where you're going to be creating, but also profiling content from the point of view of what the profile cards and pattern cards and that sort of stuff. You obviously going to use it to allocate engagement value to different goals and outcomes across your website. It's going to be still what you're using to define who your user personas are and using it to run experiments. But then take all this information and actually find a way to push it into Google Analytics. And in that way, it can provide some even richer context to the data that you have sitting there in Google Analytics, so that when you go to create a segment in Google Analytics, you can now tap into not just information that Google Analytics picks up, but also information that was previously stored within Sitecore. So the types of things that we normally look at integrating, as I said, GA doesn't do a great job out of the box of understanding what the content is that a user is seeing. It's typically, as I said, just the page title and the URL that it captures. But if you have a bunch of information there in Sitecore around what tags or content taxonomy does it sit under, what's the category, the topic, what the author, who's the word count, pushing that information into Google Analytics lets you do a much better job of analyzing, I guess, where your content strategy is working or not working, what sort of blogs you should produce more or less of. And that's quite a hard task to do without adding that data in. You have data that you can push in, as I said, around the engagement value score, what persona people fit into. If you are using, if you have a more sophisticated Sitecore implementation and you have, you're already kind of integrating it with your CRM, for argument's sake, or you have other data that's feeding into the Sitecore databases, then you could pass that through as part of the integration as well. And what we would normally do is pass the information about what test experiences people have seen, be it either personalization or A/B testing, because this ability to slice and dice is a great way to it's a great way to analyze the results of the test and work out what factors drove the result that you saw. So in terms of how this integration actually happens, unfortunately, as with most things Sitecore, because it is so customizable, there's not really an off-the-shelf plugin that you can just kind of install in 5 minutes, like if it were a WordPress or something like that. And hey, presto, you've got the data in Google Analytics. So obviously there's an entire piece of work that sits around what information you want to actually push into Google Analytics. But where you are wanting Google Analytics to understand information about the page that someone is looking at or who they are as a user, there is kind of a standard approach for getting that information into Google Analytics, and it's called a data layer. So I'm not going to go into like a massive amount of technical detail here about what that does. You can read this developer's guide that Google have available. I'll send that to your devs if you're interested. But what I will do is show you at a high level what that looks like. So someone lands on the page here. We have for a petrol company in Australia. They open a navigation menu. And then there's this kind of object that's sitting on the page, hidden to the user, that's storing information about who they are, what the page is about, and what interactions they're making with the page. So in this instance, the developer has implemented some code such that when someone opens the navigation menu, it populates this information to the data layer saying, well, it was a click on the navigation menu with a label of open. And basically, as most of you are probably using Google Tag Manager if you're using Google Analytics, and Google Tag Manager sits there listening for new bits of information that are added to this data layer object on the page. And once it hears a new bit of information, you can set it up to trigger that information to be sent off to Google Analytics. This is what a tracking call looks like when some information is being sent to Google Analytics. In this case, it's the same one, being that the navigation menu is opened. And lo and behold, you can then go about creating your amazing insights. So it's not necessarily a 5-minute or 1-day process to go through to integrate Google Analytics with Sitecore and push the information through in this way, but it is a method that is used for any other information about interactions and stuff that are sent to Google Analytics. And there's a whole bunch of documentation sitting out there on the internet about how to use this data layer and how to configure Google Tag Manager to pick up on the information that's added to it. So you've got to the stage of you've pushed the information across to Google Analytics, or actually before that stage, you need to make a decision about where in Google Analytics you store the information. So there's not just kind of one catch-all place that you send all the information about a user. There's different types of data points in Google Analytics that have different strengths or weaknesses, depending on the type of information you want to send there. And so there is also a bit of a decision-making process around where and how you're going to store this information in Google Analytics. For example, you have event tracking, which is probably the simplest way, and that's what, if you have tracking on any kind of like in-page interactions, like people are clicking on buttons or menus and you're recording that in Google Analytics, that's probably where you're already storing that information. There's kind of custom dimensions and metrics. You get a limited number of those if you're on the free Google Analytics version, but you can set one up called persona, for argument's sake, a custom dimension that is, and then you could set up your Google Tag Manager such that when it picks up a persona from that data layer, that's the place in Google Analytics that it sends it to. And you have content grouping as well, which is a way of, which I'll go into in a little bit greater detail later on, but it's basically a way of grouping content based on the taxonomy that you send into GA in a more robust way than just using the like the URL structure or something like that. So yeah, there's, I guess, unfortunately also here, there's no easy answers as to where you send this information. You really need to think first about what type of information it is, and then when you've got it in there, what questions do you hope to answer with it? And then the answer might become a bit clearer. So this is, from looking at the list of people who signed up for this webinar, it is a mixed level in terms of familiarity with Google Analytics. So I will just speak briefly about what you can do to actually tap into this information once you've got it within Google Analytics. So as I mentioned, one of the key strengths of GA is this concept of segmentation and the ability to look at a report. In this case, it's one on like the type of devices that are coming to your website, so mobile, desktop, whatever, and apply a segment over the top of that report saying that only show me the information from this report where it matches certain criteria. Like, for example, only show me this report and the information on this report where it's a mobile user. But you can also say then, when you have this custom information in GA, you can say, only show me this report where someone had an engagement value score of more than 50, or only show me this report where they had a persona of new car buyer, or whatever it is about your organization and the data you're sending in, you can define these groups of people that you're interested in looking at using these segments. And it's really the combination of the reports in Google Analytics combined with some level of segmentation that will let you get the most value from the data that you're sending in there. So yeah, after you click Add Segment, there's kind of a demonstration of what the dialog looks like. So you can put in information about where their location is, what their age, gender, or interest category is, because there's also some, I'll also go into that, but there's also some data already in GA around that about your website users. The other way, if you're already looking at a report, in this case, as I said, the device category report, is that you'll see this secondary dimension up the top. And a secondary dimension basically says, break down each of the data points in the primary dimension, which is their device category, and show me a breakdown against some other dimension, like maybe age, gender, landing page, or whatever else. So in this instance, for argument's sake, I added a secondary dimension of country. And now I'm not just seeing a top-line view of how many visits from desktop, mobile, and tablet. I'm seeing a view broken down by what country they came from. So you can see mobile is represented multiple times, as are the other devices, because it's got one row for each country device category combination. So you probably want to have a play around and get a bit more familiar with this concept of segmentation if you're not already. But those would be the two main and easiest methods to apply it to your data, using literally applying a segment or using the secondary dimension on the report. And honestly, the more you become familiar with those two features of Google Analytics, the more value you'll be able to extract. Because any of this data that you're just looking at a top line level without some level of segmentation, it's not going to be too helpful to you. So one thing that we're doing, which you can do by sending this information into Google Analytics, is using it as actually the source of truth for the personalization and testing activities that we're doing out of Sitecore. So yeah, I guess the point from the start of the webinar stands that if GA is your marketing source of truth, it probably makes sense for it to be your source of truth with respect to testing as well. The other thing is that when you're looking at the performance of tests in Google Analytics, in Sitecore, I should say, it's only going to show you against the results as against a primary success metric, like one goal. Whereas in GA, you can kind of look at those groups that saw each experience and then look at a whole bunch of different metrics relating to the people in each group. So it provides a more sophisticated way to find out like why your test performed as it did, rather than just seeing that it lost against one goal or won against one goal and leaving it there as far as you're learning. What we're actually doing is sending all that information off from Google Analytics to a data visualization tool, Data Studio. That's another free Google product. And in that way, we can create a nice report for stakeholders that are interested in testing with all the tests in one place, what their performance was, and even some images, not the red boxes in the original, but even some images like visually representing what the control and the variation actually meant if they weren't already familiar. So another way to use this information, which is quite interesting, as I said, GA is kind of inferring from someone's browsing behavior elsewhere on the internet information about their interest category, their age, and their gender. So it's inferring, it's not information that it explicitly knows because someone's told Google. So you need to not take it with grain of salt, sorry, but it's not going to be completely accurate either. But you could apply, for example, your personas in the form of segments to these reports and find out information about like their age, demographic, and interests. And that's quite helpful in understanding, for example, like, well, maybe we need to go advertise on news and politics websites if it's the case that people who purchase heavy truck purchases, that's their most popular affinity category. Once you have your persona information in GA, you can use it to kind of map out what the customer journeys look like. So it's consistent feedback that we get is that personalization can be pretty tricky because it's not necessarily straightforward to understand who your personas are and what volume they come to the website, what their journey looks like. But if you have that information around what the person's persona is and you create a segment based on it, you can apply it to all these other reports and find out more about them. That will help you with that personalization, I guess, hypothesis generation. So you could say, for argument's sake, which personas have the longest buyer journeys, so which have the most sessions between when they first come and when they transact, because you could argue that someone with a long buyer journey, they're prime for personalization because it's probably, there's a bit of friction there that we can work to alleviate. You could look at, if you had a landing page report, you could look at what are the key re-entry points and touch points for returning visitors from each persona, because obviously we want to, if all your returning visitors of persona type prospect come back via some page other than the homepage, then the homepage isn't where we'd look to target personalization efforts. You can do marketing attribution once you've got this information in Google Analytics. So you could look at, for argument's sake, if we know that, and this is another example of a segment, I should say, but if we know that someone has a persona of type private ISA, depending on what the business is, we could look at using this segment. We could say only show me users with that type of persona where it's their first visit, and then you could go and apply that to marketing channel reports, and all of a sudden you know which marketing channels it is that are actually creating awareness amongst personas of that type, rather than just having, I guess, a top-line view, which always is not the most helpful about overall what channels are creating awareness. And then obviously, I mean, you go and invest more in that channel if that's a persona that you want to create more awareness amongst. You can, as I mentioned, you can create these calculated metrics in Google Analytics, and you could create one around, you combine like your ad spend data, which might be in there because of this marketing, the kind of integration with the other Google marketing products. And you could use that in a calculation with the user's engagement value to work out what is the cost that you're spending per engagement value point that you're generating. And that could be a more nuanced way to understand how effective your ad spend is. And you can create audiences within Google Analytics that you can then retarget on other products like the display network. So you could create a segment in the audience builder saying, show me people where they had this persona and this engagement value score. And then you could use that to tailor the creative that you're putting out there on the display network, or you could raise or lower how much you're bidding if they have a high or low engagement score. There's something in Google Analytics called sequential segments, not just segments, but you can say, show me like a sequence of events, show me a group of users that had a particular sequence of events. So in this case, if we had personas set up around the buyer journey, so awareness, consideration, decision, or whatever that looks like for your organization, you could show one group of users, which is the ones that successfully moved from awareness, and then it was followed by moving into consideration. And you could divide that into the number that just started at awareness full stop. And in that way, you have an understanding of how effectively you're moving users from one stage of the buyer journey to the next one. That might mean that you need to invest in more content that helps move people from awareness to consideration, or whatever other decisions come off the back of that. As I mentioned, Google Analytics captures really limited information about the content people are looking at. So it really does make sense to push in information about the content taxonomy and categories outside of just the title and page path, because it's a real pain if you have, maybe you have content of that sits within a taxonomy group with other content, but the URL structure isn't similar at all. And in that case, it's near on impossible to actually understand collectively how that content's performing in GA. However, if you pushed in information about the categories things are sitting under, then it would aggregate the performance information against one of those categories. And it's a much more meaningful way to look at how your content is performing. And I should say as well, like there's this user flow report that sits in GA that can show you how people are moving from page to page. It's not particularly helpful if you don't have these content groups set up, because there's literally like 1 million different paths that people could be taking across your website, because by default, it just shows like a URL by URL kind of approach to where people journey through. But when you have the content group set up, you have aggregation there. So now we can see that the most popular place people move to from the blog pages is to About Us. We're not doing a very good job of moving into the services type content. So do we need to look at how we promote that on those pages? The final one is actually looking at the question a bit in reverse, not just how Sitecore data can help with what you're doing in Google Analytics, but how Google Analytics and other like quantitative data can help you with respect to what you're doing in Sitecore. Because we always have, when we talk to people about engagement value, a lot of feedback that we get is that it seems kind of arbitrary how it's being set. Like maybe you have a card sorting exercise with a group of senior stakeholders to decide what are the most important interactions that a user could be having, and then kind of allocate points on that basis. But there's still a question about whether you've made the right decisions. What you can do in GA, if you're going through the process of setting up that engagement value allocation, is to do things like look at, for a particular conversion goal, what percentage of users on the website ever did it. And if, for argument's sake, you were thinking about allocating 50 points out of 100 to a goal, but only 1% of users who converted, I should say, were actually doing it, then you would question whether it is actually that important a goal that it's worth 50 points. Or conversely, imagine you gave a goal 10 points, but then when you looked at their likelihood to convert, it actually made them like 7 times more likely than the rest of the website audience. In that instance, you would say, well, that goal's actually, or that interaction is probably a pretty important one. So maybe 10 points needs to be a bit higher. Yeah, so that is the webinar presentation today. I believe we might have some questions, Mario.
Yes, we do, Doug. We've got lots of questions actually come in. If you want to if you have a question you would like Doug to answer, just please put it into the right-hand side toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll try and answer it now. If we can't, we'll try and answer it in the next couple of days. So just looking through the questions, Doug. If Sitecore session data is more accurate, could you configure the integration to use Sitecore session and page view data instead of GA?
I don't really see how that would be possible. You can, you could also look at doing things like pushing the Sitecore identifier for that user through to Google Analytics, so that then you have a kind of you could then, I guess, you have a key that's linking the two bits of information, so you could do some reconciliation later on. And you could, I guess, like you could in a really hacky way pass through the page view number of page views to GA, but I think there's probably more meaningful things you can do with that integration than that.
Okay, cool. Another question: can you feed GA data into Sitecore Analytics?
Well, again, Google Analytics has an API, so you can extract information via the API. You can't, out of the box, extract information at the level of individual users from Google Analytics, which is why I was getting back to that point about how Sitecore is generally better for looking at the behavior of individual users. Yeah, I guess you could, but the question would need to be asked, like, to what purpose, like what information do you intend on putting in there, etc.
Okay, cool. Got another question. Any suggestions for having Sitecore goals events piggyback onto GA in the data layer and potentially other systems like application insights?
You might need to clarify that question with me via email.
Okay.
Don't quite understand.
Paul, I will send you an email afterwards, just to get a few more details, and we'll answer that offline. Got a question, just one second. Okay, we have a question coming from Alexa. If we have GA set up and working and want to integrate Sitecore data, what would you say are the best first steps to do this? How do we get started with setting up on the Sitecore side?
Again, that might be a question that needs a little bit more context, because I don't know, like, is it with respect to creating an engagement value or defining personas and that sort of stuff? Maybe you could email that one through.
Okay, all right. We've had quite a lot of questions come in, but actually we've come up to the half-hour mark, and we always promise we'll keep these sessions short, sweet, so you can get your your day back. So any questions which we haven't managed to answer, we will ping through an email afterwards, hoping to answer them as well. And if you've got any further questions, feel free to just ping Doug email. His email address is on the screen. Today's session was recorded, and I'll share a link to this in the next couple of days. Just want to say thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy days to attend, and I hope you found the session useful. Thank you, Doug.
Thanks, everyone.